Hello, dear listeners. Today you will hear a story about how a plea from an unexpected source forced a soldier to make a choice between ending a war and losing his life. By the way, write in the comments which city you are from. We're very curious to know. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The drone's wreckage smelled of ozone and shattered hope. Then I saw the etched symbol, unlike any enemy marking I'd ever seen. Sergeant Miller moved through the shattered remains of what was once a village, the scent of dust and decay clinging to the air like a shroud. Every step crunched on rubble, a grim, monotonous soundtrack to the desolation that had become his world. It had been 7 months since the ambush that took his squad, Alpha 6. 7 months since he'd woken up screaming from the same nightmare, the blinding flash, the guttural screams. Then, the suffocating silence. He was the only one left. The weight of it was a constant dull ache behind his ribs, a phantom limb he carried into every patrol, a ghost in every shadow. He was a veteran of 2 tours, the relentless desert sun having long since baked away any illusions about glory or heroism. All that was left was the job, the mission, and the ever-present company of his ghosts. The current mission was a routine recon, a sweep through Sector Gamma 7, a forgotten stretch of desert where the enemy was known to test their new toys. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, which, in Miller's experience, made it the perfect place for something catastrophic to occur. PFC Rodriguez, fresh out of basic, walked point, his M4 held a little too tight, his eyes darting with a nervous energy Miller recognized all too well. Miller watched him, a quiet, almost paternal protectiveness stirring within him. Rodriguez reminded him of himself, once, before the desert had bleached the idealism from his bones and etched lines of perpetual weariness around his eyes. They'd been out for 3 days, the sun baking the grit into their skin, the monotonous rhythm of patrol a slow poison. Miller's mind, however, was never truly quiet. The faces of his old squad, especially Garcia, the medic who'd always had a joke ready, flickered at the edge of his vision. He could still feel the phantom weight of Garcia's hand on his shoulder, hear his easy laugh, just before the world exploded into fire and shrapnel. That memory, that precise moment, was his personal hell. A loop of terror and grief he replayed in the dark. He'd learned to live with it, to compartmentalize the horror, but it was always there, a razor's edge in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the cost of war. The enemy drones they usually encountered were predictable, buzzing threats, easily identified by their distinct acoustic signature and blocky utilitarian design. They were tools of death, nothing more, easily dismissed as mere extensions of a faceless enemy. But as they cleared a particularly ravaged section, a collapsed watchtower overlooking a dry wadi, Rodriguez stopped dead, his M4 snapping up. "Sergeant, over here!" Miller moved up, M4 at the ready, his senses on high alert. A drone, or what was left of it, lay half buried in the fine, wind-blown sand, its chassis twisted and scorched, one wing sheared off. This wasn't one of their usual models. It was sleek, more advanced. A prototype, perhaps, its alloys gleaming dully even in its ruined state. The air around it still carried the faint, acrid smell of ozone, a signature of its advanced propulsion system, a smell that spoke of cutting-edge technology and destructive power. Miller knelt, examining the wreckage with a practiced eye. The enemy had been pushing their tech lately, trying to gain an edge, and every piece of new hardware was a potential intelligence goldmine. Captain Davies, Miller's CO, was always on their ass about intelligence gathering. "Anything salvageable, Miller?" Davies would ask, his voice clipped, by the book. "Just bring back data." But this drone was different. As Miller ran a gloved hand over the fractured casing, his fingers brushed against something raised, something deliberately carved into the metal. It wasn't a serial number, not a manufacturer's mark, nor any standard enemy insignia. It was a symbol, intricate and flowing, almost organic, like a stylized tree or a branching river, its lines etched with surprising precision. It pulsed with an alien familiarity, a curiosity that cut through the combat fatigue and the ingrained cynicism. He pulled out his multi-tool, carefully prying open a warped access panel near the drone's core. The internal components were a mess of fried circuits, a tangle of wires and melted plastic, but a small, heavily shielded data drive seemed miraculously intact. He carefully extracted it, noting the unusual level of protection. This was highly unusual. Enemy tech was typically designed to self-destruct or be heavily encrypted to prevent data recovery. Why leave this seemingly vulnerable data drive? He secured the drive in a waterproof pouch, the strange symbol still burning in his mind. Back at the forward operating base, the air was thick with the usual hum of generators, the distant thud of artillery, a constant dull heartbeat. Miller headed straight to the intel tent, a cramped space filled with blinking screens, the scent of stale coffee, and the quiet intensity of digital warfare. He handed the drive to Specialist Chen, a quiet tech whiz with glasses thicker than a tank's viewport, whose fingers danced across keyboards with an almost supernatural speed. "See what you can get off this, Chen. It's a new model, found it near Gamma 7. Looks like a prototype." Chen nodded, his eyes already scanning the drive, plugging it into a secure terminal. Miller watched over his shoulder, a strange tension building in his gut. The symbol kept replaying in his mind, that intricate, almost delicate design. It felt profoundly out of place, a whisper of something beyond the brutal efficiency of war. Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code scrolling rapidly across the screen. After a few minutes, he frowned, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. "Sir, this is weird." "Weird how?" Miller asked, leaning closer, the smell of ozone still faintly clinging to his uniform. "The encryption is standard, nothing we haven't seen before, but the data itself. It's fragmented, and not military comms. It looks like personal files, and there's a recurring sequence buried deep within the fragments." Chen isolated the sequence, a string of seemingly random characters, a digital breadcrumb. "It's like a hidden message, sir. Not a threat, not intel, just code." Miller felt a chill despite the desert heat, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with danger. A hidden message from an enemy drone? This wasn't standard operating procedure. This wasn't a threat, not in the conventional sense. It was something else entirely. The thought was unsettling, a ripple in the calm, cynical surface of his combat-hardened mind. He wondered if this was some new psyop, a sophisticated attempt to sow confusion, to undermine their morale. But the symbol, the strange, non-military data, felt too personal, too deliberate for a mere tactic. It felt like a voice, reaching out from the abyss of conflict. He stared at the screen, at the jumbled characters that promised to reveal something, anything, beyond the relentless grind of combat. The silence in the intel tent, broken only by the whirring of the server and Chen's soft keystrokes, felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. The message, whatever it was waiting. And Miller had a feeling it was about to change everything. He dismissed Chen, telling him to keep digging, to find a way to unscramble the rest of it, to piece together the digital puzzle. Miller walked out of the tent, the desert night cool against his face, a stark contrast to the burning questions in his mind. This wasn't just another piece of enemy tech. This was something different, something that tugged at a part of him he thought had long since died. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps even hope. The symbol, the fragmented code, it was all too deliberate to be random, too carefully placed to be accidental. He needed answers, and he had a gut feeling that those answers wouldn't be found in any military manual, nor would they be easily understood by his superiors. As Miller walked back to his cot, the weight of the unknown settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't a threat in the way he understood threats. It was something far more unsettling. He just didn't know what yet, but the seed of profound change had been planted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The faces of my squad, frozen in that last impossible moment. This message, it felt like a betrayal to their memory. The drone's drive, a mangled shard of enemy tech, had yielded a fragmented code. It was a puzzle, a series of seemingly random characters interspersed with what looked like scientific notation, unlike any standard enemy encryption Miller had ever encountered. He'd spent the better part of 2 days, fueled by lukewarm coffee and grim determination, hunched over a battered field laptop in the makeshift comms tent. The air in the tent was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of electronics, a stark contrast to the biting desert wind outside that rattled the canvas walls. He'd bypass standard decryption protocols, a move that would earn him a court-martial if discovered, but the unusual symbol etched onto the drone's casing, a stylized double helix intertwined with a broken gear, had gnawed at him. Captain Davies, his superior, would have dismissed it as enemy propaganda or a system glitch, another ghost in the machine. But Miller had seen enough of those ghosts to know this wasn't one. This was deliberate. The initial fragments had been confusing, a jumble of technical terms and what seemed like philosophical musings on the nature of conflict and innovation. He'd tried running it through standard translation software, but it had choked on the syntax, spitting out gibberish. This wasn't standard military comms. It felt personal, almost academic. Miller remembered a briefing from years ago, an obscure intelligence report about the enemy's scientific elite, how they often develop their own coded dialects to protect intellectual property and maintain a competitive edge. It was a long shot, a desperate reach, but he started cross-referencing the unusual terms with known scientific papers from the enemy's pre-war archives, a meticulous, painstaking process that stretched over 2 sleepless nights. His eyes burned, his head throbbed, but the faint glimmer of understanding kept him going. PFC Rodriguez, a young, observant soldier in his current squad, had brought him extra rations and coffee, noticing the intensity in Miller's eyes, but wisely asking no questions. Miller appreciated the silent support. It was a small anchor in a sea of growing uncertainty, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken burden he carried. The breakthrough came with a linguistic database he'd salvaged from a captured enemy hard drive months ago, a relic from a different skirmish. It wasn't perfect, but it provided enough context, enough linguistic keys, to start piecing the puzzle together. The message wasn't just text. It was embedded with a low-frequency audio file, barely audible above the static and the incessant hum of the laptop's fan. When Miller finally cleaned it up, isolating the audio track, a voice, calm but undeniably laced with desperation, filled his earbuds. It was a woman's voice, speaking in their enemy's language, but with an accent Miller vaguely recognized from pre-deployment intelligence briefings. A scientific dialect, precise and almost melodic, devoid of the harsh gutturals he associated with enemy combatants. She didn't immediately introduce herself. Instead, she spoke of a profound moral crisis, of technology outpacing ethics, of a creation spiraling out of control. Miller's stomach clenched. He knew that tone. He'd heard it in the debriefings of defectors, in the hushed confessions of prisoners of war. It was the sound of a person at their breaking point. Then she introduced herself. Dr. Aris Thorne, a lead researcher in advanced propulsion systems for the enemy's military. Propulsion systems. The words hit Miller like a physical blow. His squad, his boys, had been hit by a new generation of guided munitions, faster, more accurate than anything they'd encountered before. He remembered the flash, the deafening roar, the sickening silence that followed. Was this her work? Was she the architect of that horror? The rage, cold and sharp, began to prickle at him. A familiar, unwelcome guest. He almost shut it down, almost deleted the file, consigning her words to the digital void. He pictured PFC Evans's infectious grin, Specialist Chen's quiet wisdom, Sergeant Garcia's unwavering resolve, all extinguished by the very technology this woman helped create. But a word, repeated several times, caught his attention, cutting through the red haze of his anger. Peace, not victory, not domination, but peace. It was a discordant note in the symphony of his grief, a whisper that demanded attention. He continued to listen, translating as best he could, the words slowly forming a horrifying and utterly unexpected picture. Dr. Thorne wasn't boasting. She was pleading, her voice cracking with an urgency that transcended language barriers. She spoke of a project, Project Chimera, designed to create a weapon so devastating it would force an end to the war through sheer terror. Miller recalled fragmented intelligence reports, whispers in the command tent about a game changer the enemy was developing, something beyond conventional warfare. He'd dismissed it as propaganda, a scare tactic, but Thorne claimed it had gone beyond its original intent, becoming something uncontrollable, a self-aware destructive force that threatened both sides, a technological leviathan that would consume everything in its path. She was a prisoner in her own facility, she explained, forced to work under duress, and believed her only hope was to reach out to the other side, to them. She offered intel, schematics, vulnerabilities, anything to stop it. She even hinted at a back door, a way to neutralize Chimera before it was unleashed. The facility was deep within enemy territory, a place they called the Foundry, a name whispered with dread even among their own intelligence, a black site rumored to be impenetrable. Thorne's message wasn't just a plea for help, it was a desperate gamble, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of hatred and bloodshed, a fragile bridge built on the ashes of countless lives. Miller stared at the screen, the words blurring, the weight of their implication pressing down on him. His duty, drilled into him since boot camp, was clear. Report enemy intelligence, exploit weaknesses, eliminate threats. But this wasn't a threat in the conventional sense. This was a human being, trapped, offering a chance, however slim, to end the very conflict that had cost him everything. The faces of his squad, PFC Evans with his perpetual grin, Specialist Chen with his quiet wisdom, Sergeant Garcia, his rock. They flashed before his eyes, vivid and painful. Was this a betrayal of their memory, to even consider listening to the architect of their destruction? Or was it the only way to honor their sacrifice, to prevent more senseless deaths? The weight of their loss pressed down on him, a physical ache that settled deep in his bones, colder than the desert night. Miller pushed away from the laptop, the chair scraping loudly on the tent floor. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the exhaustion etched into every line. The comms tent felt too small, too hot, suffocating. He walked out into the cool desert night, the vast expanse of stars, a million indifferent eyes above him, mocking his terrestrial turmoil. The wind whipped at his fatigues, carrying the distant rumble of artillery, a constant low thrum that was the heartbeat of this war. He thought of McMillan, his grizzled second-in-command, a man who'd seen too many wars, who carried his own ghosts. Mac would tell him to follow orders, to trust the chain of command, to not get emotionally involved. But Mac also understood the futility, the endless grind of it all, the way war consumed men and left nothing but dust. Miller looked back at the tent, at the faint glow of the laptop screen, a beacon in the darkness. Dr. Thorne's words echoed in his mind, a chance for true peace, not just a pause in the fighting. He knew the risk. Reporting it meant Thorne would be a target, likely eliminated by their own forces to prevent intelligence leaks, her plea silenced forever. Ignoring it meant Project Chimera could unleash untold devastation, a weapon of mass terror that would make his squad's demise seem like a footnote. And acting on it, that was unthinkable. A rogue operation, defying direct orders, crossing enemy lines to save someone who, by all accounts, should be an enemy. It was madness, a suicidal folly that would cost him his career, his freedom, perhaps his life. But the alternative, the endless cycle of violence, the perpetual grind of loss and retribution, felt like a deeper, more insidious madness. He had to make a choice, and the vast, silent desert offered no easy answers, only the echo of his own conflicted heart. Miller knows he should report it, follow orders. But the scientist's words, a desperate whisper of peace, gnaw at his conscience, forcing him to consider an impossible choice. Orders are orders. But what if the order is wrong? What if the real enemy isn't who we're told it is? Miller's mind replayed Thorne's desperate plea, a stark contrast to the ingrained doctrine of us versus them that boot camp had hammered into him. Every fiber of his being, every ounce of discipline forged in fire, screamed against the thought of defying direct command. Yet, the scientist's words, a fragile hope of peace, resonated deeper than any battle cry. The weight of his secret was a physical burden, pressing down on him in the cramped confines of the forward operating base. The stale air of the barracks, thick with the scent of sweat, stale coffee, and gun oil, seemed to amplify his isolation. A stark loneliness he'd never felt even in the thick of combat, surrounded by his men. He watched his squad from the corner of the mess tent, the low hum of conversation and the clatter of mess kits a familiar, comforting rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on their tired faces. Rodriguez, young and earnest, was regaling McMillan with a story about a botched patrol, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. He gestured wildly with a spoon, nearly impaling a stray fly. Mac, ever the stoic, just grunted, wiping his mustache with the back of his hand, but Miller saw the faint flicker of amusement in his eyes, a rare, fleeting glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior. These men, his men, trusted him implicitly. They followed his orders without question, believed in his judgment, his gut. How could he even begin to explain the impossible choice now laid before him? The sheer audacity of it felt like a betrayal of their trust before he'd even uttered a word. The message, still encrypted on a burner tablet he kept hidden beneath his bunk, burned a hole in his conscience, a digital ember glowing with impossible possibilities. Dr. Thorne wasn't just asking for extraction, he was offering a way out, a path to de-escalation, perhaps even an end to this grinding, senseless war. A war that had claimed so much, including the lives of his previous squad. He closed his eyes for a moment, and their faces flashed behind his eyelids. Ramirez, always cracking jokes. Chen, meticulous and quiet. Sergeant Evans, his steady hand. They had died following orders, believing in the mission. Would they have understood this? Would they have seen it as a desecration of their sacrifice, or a desperate attempt to ensure no more sacrifices were made? The thought twisted his gut. To pursue Thorne's offer meant treason, a court-martial at best, a bullet at worst. Captain Davies, by the book and ambitious, would see it as nothing less than a betrayal of everything they stood for, a stain on the unit's record. Miller knew the protocols. Any enemy intelligence, especially something as sensitive as a potential defector, went straight up the chain. No questions, no deviations. Yet, the thought of handing Thorne over, knowing what interrogation likely entailed, the cold rooms, the relentless questions, the breaking of a man's spirit, felt like a betrayal of a different kind. A betrayal of humanity itself, a surrender to the very dehumanization they claimed to fight against. He started to subtly gather intelligence, poring over old dog-eared maps of the enemy sector, the paper brittle with age and use. He cross-referenced patrol routes, looking for blind spots, weak points in the enemy's perimeter, areas where surveillance might be sparse. He'd spend hours in the comms tent, ostensibly checking equipment, the static crackle of the radios a constant backdrop, but really listening to chatter, trying to gauge the enemy's readiness, their patterns, any subtle shifts in their routine. It was a dangerous game. One false move, and he'd be exposed, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. The sheer audacity of what he was contemplating made his stomach clench, a knot of fear and grim determination. He remembered a training exercise years ago, where they had been lectured on the enemy mindset, a monolithic, faceless threat, devoid of individual thought or feeling. Thorne's message shattered that illusion, revealing a human being, trapped and desperate, on the other side. This wasn't some abstract enemy, it was a man, just like him, caught in the gears of a war he no longer believed in. He found himself thinking about his fallen squad again, their faces vivid in his mind's eye. Would they have understood? Would they have condemned him for even considering this? Their sacrifice, their memory, was a heavy cloak he wore, and this choice felt like a desecration of it, a betrayal of the blood spilled. But what if honoring their sacrifice meant preventing more? What if it meant choosing a different path than the one that led to their graves? This question gnawed at him, a relentless parasite on his conscience. One evening, under the pretense of checking defensive perimeters, the desert wind whipping sand against his face, he found himself talking to McMillan. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of diesel and dust. "Mac," Miller started, his voice low, almost a whisper against the wind. "You ever just wonder what the hell we're fighting for? Beyond the orders, beyond the flag, I mean. What's the real point?" McMillan paused, taking a slow, deliberate drag from a cigarette, the cherry glowing fiercely in the dim light. "Been wondering that since Nam, Sarge," he exhaled a plume of smoke. "But we're here now, and we do our job. That's all there is to it, ain't it?" Miller nodded, the unspoken weight of his secret pressing down. McMillan's pragmatic realism was a stark contrast to the idealism that had driven Miller in his younger days, an idealism that Thorne's message was now rekindling, however faintly, like a dying ember catching a fresh breath of air. He saw a new recruit, PFC Chen, no relation to his fallen comrade, but the name still stung, meticulously cleaning his rifle, his face a picture of focused determination. Chen had that fresh-faced enthusiasm, the kind Miller himself had possessed before the war had ground it down, leaving behind only grit and scars. It was a stark reminder of what they were fighting to protect and what they stood to lose. Not just lives, but innocence, hope. Miller almost confided in McMillan once, the words hovering on his tongue during a quiet moment on watch. The vast, star-strewn sky, a silent witness. "Mac, But he bit it back. The risk too great. The potential fallout too catastrophic. The isolation was absolute. He was alone with this, a solitary figure wrestling with a decision that could unravel everything. He began to test the waters, subtly at first, dropping hypothetical scenarios into conversations. "Hey, Mac," he'd say casually, as if discussing a training exercise. "If hypothetically we had intel on a high-value target, say, a scientist, deep behind enemy lines, but the intel was unconventional, not standard channels. What's the play?" McMillan had just shrugged, flicking his cigarette butt into the sand. "Depends on the intel, Sarge, but usually you report it. Let command sort it out. That's above our pay grade." Miller knew that, but above our pay grade felt like a cop-out when lives, potentially millions of them, hung in the balance, when the very trajectory of the war could be altered. He started to look at the enemy's known technological capabilities, the kind of advanced drone tech they had recovered. Thorne had mentioned specific research, a breakthrough in energy weapons suppression. If it was true, it could shift the balance of power, or, more importantly, provide a deterrent that could force a ceasefire, a genuine path to peace rather than just another temporary lull in the fighting. He started sketching out routes, mental maps of infiltration and extraction points, identifying potential safe houses, abandoned structures that could serve as temporary shelters. He was planning an unsanctioned mission, a ghost operation, moving in the shadows, defying authority, and the thought both terrified and invigorated him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was preparing to act like the very insurgents they were fighting, operating outside the established rules, a rogue element. He knew the risks: court-martial, dishonorable discharge, imprisonment, or, worse, a bullet from either side. The thought of facing Captain Davies, explaining his actions, the cold fury in the captain's eyes, was almost as daunting as facing enemy fire. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting Thorne's plea fall on deaf ears, allowing the war to grind on, consuming more lives, more hope, felt like a far greater failure, a moral capitulation. He thought about the political climate, the endless cycle of retaliations, the propaganda from both sides, each painting the other as absolute evil. Thorne's message cut through all of it, a raw, unfiltered cry for help from someone who claimed to see a different way, a glimmer of shared humanity. Miller, hardened by years of combat, by loss and disillusionment, had never considered himself a man of faith or grand ideals. He was a soldier, a pragmatist. But this felt different. This was a chance, however slim, to make a real difference, to honor the fallen not by continuing the fight, but by seeking an end to it, by reaching for a peace that felt increasingly out of reach. The decision solidified in the dead of night, under the cold, indifferent gaze of the desert moon. The air was still, save for the distant thrum of generators and the occasional bark of a guard dog. He sat on his cot, the burner tablet clutched in his hand, the dim, blue-white light from its screen illuminating the lines of Thorne's plea, etching them into his mind. He remembered a conversation with his father, a veteran of a different war, his voice raspy with age and memory, who had once told him, "Son, sometimes the hardest fight ain't with the enemy, it's with yourself, deciding what's right when everyone else says it's wrong. And sometimes doing what's right means standing alone." This was that fight, distilled to its rawest form. He knew what he had to do. He would go. He would try to reach Thorne. He would risk everything. The silence in the comms tent was deafening when he finally made his move, the faint hum of the equipment the only sound. He tapped into a secure off-grid channel he'd been building for weeks, a digital ghost in the machine. It was a direct line, untraceable, designed for this very purpose, a lifeline thrown into the void. He sent a single coded message, a prearranged signal to a contact he'd cultivated in the shadows, a former operative with a network of his own, someone who understood the gray areas of war, the blurred lines between right and wrong. The message was simple, stark in its brevity. Package inbound, high value, ETA to be confirmed. He hadn't told his squad yet, not fully. The full truth was too dangerous, too destabilizing, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't do this alone. Macmillan, for all his pragmatism, had a loyalty that ran deeper than regulations, a quiet strength Miller had always relied on, and Rodriguez, with his youthful idealism, his unwavering belief in doing the right thing, might just be crazy enough to believe in a different kind of fight, one fought with hope instead of bullets. He looked at the worn photo of his old squad, tucked into his helmet, their smiling faces a stark contrast to the grim reality of his present. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "or don't, but I have to try, for all of us." The path ahead was a minefield, a treacherous journey into enemy territory and against the very system he had sworn to uphold. But as the first faint streaks of dawn touched the horizon, painting the desert sky in hues of blood and fire, Sergeant Miller felt a strange sense of clarity, a quiet resolve settling deep in his bones. He had made his decision, and now he would live with the consequences, whatever they may be. The next step, the uncharted path to peace, would begin at first light, a desperate gamble in a war that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of hope. The silence in the comms was louder than any firefight. It was the sound of a decision hanging in the balance, a life, perhaps many lives, dependent on my next move. Miller checked his watch, the luminous hands crawling towards 0:30. The desert air, usually biting cold, felt strangely warm tonight, thick with the scent of dust and the metallic tang of distant conflict. He ran a gloved thumb over the worn stock of his service rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort against the enormity of what lay ahead. This wasn't a patrol. This was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice that could either save lives or damn him and the two men who'd volunteered to follow him into this madness. Macmillan, a shadow against the muted starlight, gave a curt nod. Rodriguez, younger, still with that wide-eyed eagerness despite the grime and exhaustion, adjusted his night vision goggles. They were a small unit, stripped down to bare essentials: 3 men, 3 rifles, and a single encrypted comms unit tuned to a frequency that didn't officially exist. Their objective, a derelict research outpost deep within enemy territory, a place known only through outdated intel and Thorne's cryptic coordinates. Thorne's last message, relayed through the drone's data burst, had been precise. Sector Gamma 7, abandoned comms array, midnight, alone. Miller had debated bringing more, but the fewer boots on the ground, the less chance of detection. This was a ghost operation, meant to leave no trace, no official record. The very idea of it felt like a betrayal of every protocol, every lesson hammered into them since basic training. But the image of his fallen squad, their faces etched into his memory, had overridden the rulebook. What if this was real? What if this was the key to preventing more such losses? They moved like specters, each step measured, each shadow scrutinized. The terrain was unforgiving. Jagged rocks, wind-scoured dunes, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a small village, now just a collection of bombed-out husks. Miller remembered a similar village, back in 9, a place where a routine patrol had turned into an ambush, costing him 2 good men. The memory was a cold knot in his gut, a constant reminder of the stakes. Enemy patrols were known to sweep these areas, their drones humming like angry hornets in the night sky. They skirted a known checkpoint, the faint glow of a fire visible in the distance, the muffled chatter of enemy voices, a chilling reminder of their vulnerability. Rodriguez, ever vigilant, pointed to a fresh track in the sand, a wheeled vehicle, heavy, recent. Miller signaled, "Halt," his heart thumping against his ribs. It was a close call, too close. They had to be faster, quieter. They were operating on a shoestring, no air support, no quick reaction force. Just them and the fading hope of a desperate scientist. The comms unit, a small black box, remained silent, a testament to their isolation. Every rustle of dry brush, every distant howl of a desert animal sent a jolt of adrenaline through Miller. He thought about Captain Davies, back at base, probably reviewing intel, completely oblivious to this unsanctioned foray. The thought of the court-martial, the disgrace, was a fleeting flicker quickly extinguished by the urgency of their mission. Thorne's message had painted a picture of a man trapped, a man with vital information, a man willing to risk everything. Could Miller do any less? They pressed on, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of their boots and the ragged rhythm of their breathing. The abandoned comms array, a skeletal tower against the stars, finally came into view. It was even more desolate than he'd imagined, a monument to forgotten technology. No lights, no movement. Too quiet. A trap? The thought was a cold splash of water, instantly dousing the embers of hope. But they were here, no turning back now. They approached the main building, a low-slung concrete structure half buried in sand. Macmillan took point, his rifle held ready, scanning the perimeter. Rodriguez covered the rear, his young eyes darting, absorbing every detail. Miller felt a tremor of anticipation, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the moment of truth. Macmillan signaled clear for the exterior, but the interior was a black maw. Miller took a deep breath, kicked the rusted metal door open, and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of ozone. A single flickering emergency light illuminated a small, makeshift lab. And there, hunched over a crude workbench, was a figure. Thorne! Miller's voice was a low growl, his rifle still raised. The figure flinched, slowly turning. It was a woman, not a man as Miller had instinctively assumed, her face smudged with grease and exhaustion, her eyes wide with a desperate, almost feral intelligence. Dr. Aris Thorne. "You came?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "I didn't think—" She gestured to a small, battered data chip on the table. "It's all here. The schematics, the vulnerabilities, the true nature of their project. It's not what they told you it was. It's a weapon, yes, but one that will consume us all." Her words were a torrent, a desperate spill of information. Miller grabbed the chip, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked into her eyes, seeing not an enemy, but a fellow human being trapped in a conflict she hadn't chosen. A sudden piercing whine ripped through the air. An enemy drone, close, too close. The sound was unmistakable. "They found me!" Thorne gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here!" Outside, the muffled thud of boots on sand. "Go!" Miller yelled, pushing her towards a back exit. "Macmillan, Rodriguez, cover us!" The exchange was over, but the fight had just begun. The escape was a blur of gunfire and desperate movement. Macmillan laid down suppressing fire, his seasoned instincts kicking in, while Rodriguez, surprisingly calm, provided covering shots. Miller dragged Thorne through a narrow service tunnel, the drone's whine growing louder, closer. They burst out into the open, scrambling towards their prearranged extraction point, a hidden crevice in the rocks. The enemy was hot on their heels, their shouts echoing in the night. They reached the crevice, sliding down into its shadowy depths, just as a volley of laser fire scorched the rock above them. They were safe, for now. Thorne, panting, clutched the data chip to her chest, her eyes fixed on Miller. "You saved me," she said, a raw gratitude in her voice. Miller just nodded, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. The mission was a success in a way. He had the data, and Thorne was alive. But the cost... He knew the moment they returned, if they returned, the questions would start. The court-martial. The accusations of treason. He had defied direct orders, gone against everything he was trained for. But looking at Thorne, seeing the hope rekindled in her eyes, he felt a strange sense of rightness. The war had always been black and white, us against them. Now, the lines were blurred, smudged by a shared humanity and a desperate plea for peace. He had chosen to save a soul, and perhaps, in doing so, had saved a piece of his own. The long journey back to friendly lines, under the cover of darkness, would be filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Miller felt a flicker of something he hadn't known since his squad was lost. Hope. Whether he succeeded or failed in the eyes of his command, one thing was certain. Sergeant Miller had walked a path few soldiers dared, forever changed by the faint hope of peace in the heart of war. The data chip, a small piece of plastic, now held the weight of untold futures, waiting to be unleashed. But the world, and Miller's place in it, would never be the same. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. See you soon.